We need to be telling his stories because it's kind of like if you go to Hebrews chapter 11. In the book of Hebrews, what is the message that the author is trying to give there? He's trying to tell the Christians that hang on. I know it's tough, but hang on. Then he gets to chapter 11. He's like, look at this great cloud of witnesses. That historical argument. He says, David did this, Samson did this, all these people did these things. Therefore, hang on. He's like, the evidence of history is your rationale, is your reason, is your logic to keep living faithfully. What's incumbent upon us in this moment is to look to history as we seek to live faithfully in the present. And so, what I think we have to do, and what I seek to do as both an educator and as a parent, is I try to tell my kids.
Good evening and welcome back to another episode on Relentless Pursuit of Purpose, where our goal is to help everyone enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose. If you haven't already done so, please make sure and hit the subscribe button so that you never miss a video or an interview such as we have today. Pleased to be joined by a guest I haven't known that long, but I heard him speaking at a conference recently, and I was like, hey, I need to come bring you and expose you to some other people. So I hope you gain a lot out of this interview and out of this discussion. So Theon, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you so much, Brother Alex. I'm grateful to be with you and with your viewers. And I'm an associate professor of communication at Wheaton College, right outside of Chicago, Illinois. And I'm just grateful to be in dialogue with you today.
Amen. Amen. All right. So for those that are regular viewers, this is going to be slightly different because it's not a purely apologetic discussion, but I think it has a lot of crossover, a lot of practical wisdom for what we need to do and what we need to be and how we need to live as Christians in the public sphere. So part of that public sphere is the huge sphere of education. We all go to school. Hopefully we all graduate, and definitely all of us want our kids to do that. We want our kids to graduate, to achieve well, and to be able to be free to learn in a safe and conducive environment. And so those are things we all want. And so we're just trying to have a discussion on how to be better at that. All right.
That's right.
So first question, I want to jump right in. What do you feel is not talked about enough in your specific area of interest that most of the public maybe doesn't even think about? It's not even on their radar. What would one or two of those things be?
Sure. Thank you so much. And let me say that my area of communication is really in rhetoric, which we can understand as the strategic use of symbols. How do we understand the world through communication? In this area of study, one of the things that the public doesn't pay attention enough to is how we understand truth, how we discern what a fact is. And so let's just take it a step back. We live in what's often described as a polarized society, where one person believes one thing and another person believes another thing. And we're in an election year here in the U.S., which means that people are going to have drastically different opinions that they're going to share about the best direction of our nation. These differences are not outside of the church, but they often manifest themselves inside of the church. But one of the things that we don't talk about enough is that even as we operate with different and even at times dueling belief systems, what are the foundations of those belief systems, and are they accurate? And what I'm getting at here is, how do we discern what is right and wrong, what is true and false, what is good and evil? And a lot of times we think that we have good logical strategies for discerning these things, but we never interrogate the logics we use to discern truth. And for so many of us, We live in what we'd call echo chambers due to social media, due to how we engage in community. And so we're not ever challenged to think differently. And so it's very easy for us to look at someone who's different than us and to demonize them because they operate from different logics than we do. But what we've never done is try to understand, how does this person understand the world in a way that's different than me, and what might their perspective of viewing the world have to contribute to how I understand the world. And so one of the challenges that we have in this moment is we never stop to think about, how do I discern truth from error? And is my strategy or my approach to discerning truth actually an accurate or effective means of discerning truth? We take for granted that our approach is the right way, and that hinders us from having an honest conversation about how do we identify right and wrong.
Wow, that is a great jump off, and I know I started this by saying this is not a purely apologetic discussion, but right there it is. um,
Hey, we're trying to fit in with the vibe.
yeah, man, I a lot of my apologetic ministry is in the area of philosophy, and so I talk a lot about epistemology and
Of
ontology,
course.
and specifically with epistemology, as you're talking about, like how you know what you know.
That's right.
Especially when I deal with a lot of naturalism, atheism, and things of that nature. And the foundation for how you arrive at your conclusion, even if the conclusion is correct, is still invalid. And so having that conversation to say the logical steps you took to get here are not legal.
That's right. That's right. I mean, if
Yeah.
we're going to go academic, like, what is the syllogism or the deductive reasoning or the
Yes.
inductive approach that you're taking to arrive at this identification of truth, and is it valid?
Yeah.
So, yes.
I love it. I love it. And so that's an excellent place to start. And actually, my organization is called Proof for the Truth, and the conference is the same title. And I always say, if there is no such thing as truth, we can all go home. There's nothing to talk
Sure.
about because at the end of the day,
Sure.
it's just opinion. But if truth does exist, which I believe it does, then we need to figure out what that truth is. So
Right.
thank you for that
Right.
lead in. The next question is kind of in that same vein. As an apologist, I have some experience with bad arguments,
Of course.
and so in in your world, in the education world, and it's the same thing really, because we're still talking about logic. Logic goes
Of
across
course.
every spectrum. What mistakes do you often see people make when they're having debates and arguments? So they're in it.
Yeah.
What do you see often on both sides?
Yeah. So I'm going to tell a story that I think both sides or every side makes when they're engaging in debates and arguments. My father was a criminal defense attorney in Chicago for over 30 years. And so
Oh,
he's trying high profile cases, from everything from juvenile violations to murder cases.
oh,
And as a criminal, who's engaging in criminal law, one thing that my father would always do, and one thing he would always tell us to do, is when I'm preparing a case, I have to prepare this case. He was a defense attorney, as if I'm the prosecution. I have to see all the holes in my argument, all the shortcomings, all the vulnerabilities in my argument. I have to learn to see my argument from another vantage point, because I'm not just trying to convince me of the rightness of the case I'm trying to present. I'm trying to convince someone else. So if I don't step outside of my positionality and see it from another's vantage point, I'm not going to be equipped to know all of the barriers to persuasion that exist between me and the persuasive goal that I'm trying to get my audience to. And so one of the challenges that exists today is you'll have many people trying to make persuasive arguments, but they don't understand their audiences. And they don't understand what are the barriers that lie between them and their audiences. So you could have someone who's coming at it from a theologically conservative or a theologically liberal, a politically conservative, politically liberal vantage point. I don't really care. For the sake of conversation, we're talking about argumentation, where it's like, do you understand who you're trying to convince here? Do you understand what's going to speak to them? We talk about themes like credibility, how you utilize emotional appeals, how you utilize logical appeals. Those decisions need to be tempered by who you're speaking with. And if you've not thought about how to adapt your message to who you're speaking with, you're going to risk communicating in a manner that may very well be true, but it doesn't resonate because you've not taken the time to adapt your message to your audience. And so one of the shortcomings is people think that they're speaking to a universal audience.
mm,
And especially in this fragmented culture, you have to target local communities and understand people might communicate different than you do. And if you don't adapt to that, you're going to really risk not reaching them.
That's really well said. I remember in high school, I think freshman year, the English teacher said, you have a nice speaking voice or something like that, and you should join the debate team. I had never
Yes.
heard of a debate team.
Yes.
And I joined it and I ended up loving it. And lo and behold, years later, this skill set actually pays off in the work I do. But
Yes,
the
that's
thing
right.
about a debate competition is you have to do 2 in the affirmative and 2 in the negative at every
Right.
competition, which means you don't have to just know the other side. You have to be able to pretend to be the other side and win.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I
So
think that kind of skill is lost in so many of these spaces, the public spheres that we inhabit. We're just not being forced to challenge ourselves to think about how would someone else view this differently and come to another conclusion than I am. Yeah.
yeah. No, that's really well said. I'm just thinking about all the different applications, but we don't have time for that right now. Okay, so now that we've kind of identified a problem, we've identified the foundation needs to be truth, the goal should be truth. We've identified some errors in argumentative method, but what are some methods or tactics we can use to have better conversations, and where even if we agree to disagree, we can do so and walk away amicably? And I remember you telling a story. I don't know if you can remember it right now on this line, but I don't remember if you have another one you want to tell.
Yeah. So when I think about this is what do we do to understand those with whom we are engaged in conversation? So I'll give a simple example of this. One of the areas that I think the contemporary church makes a tragic miscalculation is in the ways that it disengages or fails to engage the hip hop community. What we'll
Mm,
end up doing is we'll look at a Kendrick Lamar, we'll look at a J. Cole, we'll look at a Tupac Shakur, a Missy Elliott, a Lauryn Hill, and we'll say, oh well, they use some four-letter words there. Therefore, we are not going to engage what they're saying at all. At
mm,
the same time, we can look at the concert that Kendrick Lamar had last week in Englewood. You had an audience packed to the brim reciting every word from his songs, and they understood the logics that he was putting out there. And so, what ends up happening is that by the church disengaging from non faith based forms of hip hop, what they're doing is they're robbing themselves of opportunities to connect with and understand people that they need to reach with the gospel or people that they need to reach with discipleship. And so when
mm.
I tell people, when you're trying to engage people across lines of difference, even when you disagree with them, can you articulate their position from their viewpoint? Because what we're doing oftentimes in culture today is that we're responding to caricatures of one another. This is what a conservative believes. This is what a liberal believes. This is what a Marxist believes. This is what a libertarian believes. And most of us don't actually know anybody in that group that we're describing. But what we're doing is responding to media saturated images of who these people are. And many of the people are hearing what we're saying about different groups of people like, that's not who we are. That's not what we believe. That's not, and what does it do? It cuts off conversation. And so a key method is, can you articulate someone else's positionality in a way that they will say, yes, that's what I believe? Because if I can get us on the same page, then I can say, here's what you believe. Now here's what I believe. It's the classic critical claim that we try to teach students in writing. They say, I say. You have to understand the positionality of the first party there before you can then pivot off of it and say, here's where I'm coming to this conversation with. And if we don't take that step, what we're doing is we end up talking past one another, which is
Yeah.
what you see on all the major news networks right now. People talking past one another and never getting on the same page of conversation.
Yeah, so true, so true. I often say to people that it's like this side yells from their side, this side yells from their side, but no one actually talks to each other.
That's right. That's right.
um, yeah, yeah, and then social media just exacerbates that issue even more because
My goodness.
I asked somebody. I was teaching in church, and we were just talking on Sunday. Have you ever made a post and then somebody commented on your post? You know what? Seeing this post made me change my whole worldview. Like
Exactly.
that doesn't happen. right? And so then I think we got to question our motives sometimes. Now, I'm not saying don't ever post anything about what you believe, because I do all the time, but what's
Sure,
your purpose
sure.
for it, and are you, is it virtue signaling, or is it a real argument you're trying to really help somebody learn and understand, or is it
Right.
just trying to beat down another group?
Right. That's right. That's right. What is your communicative outcome that you're anticipating here? Yeah, that's
Mm,
exactly right. Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
I like how you said it better. Communicative outcome. And so that is a good segue into this next question. You said this
hmm
phrase, and it stuck with me, and I've been thinking about it, and I try to model it, but we do so
Yeah.
imperfectly. But how would you describe intellectual humility?
For me, intellectual humility is grounded in an interpretation of the end of First Corinthians chapter 13. If you get to
Mm,
First Corinthians 13, there's this beautiful passage where, what is Paul saying? Now we see darkly as through a glass.
mm,
And when you start to think about this, you're coming at this from an apologetic standpoint. And I think this is very relevant to this. Like, what is Paul doing? He's talking about the ways in which our ability to even perceive the truth has been fundamentally altered as a result of the devastating effects of sin. Like
mm,
Paul's like, I can't see it all. Like I know I'm limited. And in some ways, what Paul's wrestling with there is in some ways what the postmodern is wrestling with there. Can we even find truth? And what does the Christian come to that conversation with? Well, no, we can't find truth, but God reveals truth in the Son.
mm,
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so, no, I can't find truth as hard as Plato was trying in the Republic. But what I can do is I can see the divine revelation of truth in the
mm,
Son. And so when you think about intellectual humility for me is constantly keeping that reality in mind and knowing that I am trying to do the best I can to live out the truth.
mm,
But I always have to be suspicious of the effects of sin in marring my ability to perceive truth accurately, which means that I have to stay on my knees in prayer. I have to be sensitive to the prompting of the Holy Spirit, and I need to be staying fixed in God's word as the foundation of truth. But that also means that when I hold views, I need to, in some ways, I don't mean hold them loosely in terms of being blown about by every wind of doctrine, but I do mean I need to maintain a constant sense of vulnerability that says, Lord, this is what I believe to be true. But if I am wrong, please show me the error of my way. And I need to be vulnerable to be wrong. And I think I need to model that not only vertically in my relationship with God, but I also need to model it horizontally in my relationship with my fellow human beings. Because one of the things about scriptures, you see God using some unexpected characters to reveal truth. Look at brother Balaam with the donkey. The like Balaam thinks he's okay, and the donkey's like, hey, what it is, yo? Like, why you kicking me? Like, you're about to get killed. And so we don't know how God is going to choose to reveal truth. This is the story with Naaman. Naaman comes asking for healing, and he's like, go dip in that river. And he's like, that's a dirty river. I don't want to dip in the Jordan. Why can I? It's like, you don't know how God is going to reveal truth to you. So we need to approach we need to approach our belief system with a sense of intellectual humility that says, God, I'm always coming to you as the source of my truth.
amen. I love that. Maybe is there an example where either you or your students, because I know you take some of your class on these different, I'll say trips, but um,
Sure.
times where they can see different things, different cultures, and that things of that nature, where it's not that they, like you said, they didn't back down from their position or what they believe to be true, but by listening to someone else, I won't say they
Yeah.
shifted in their position, but they just understood better.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So every semester, every fall, I generally teach a class on Black political communication. And in this class on Black political communication, I welcome students from a variety of different political persuasions at a time when we are deeply polarized as a society, as we've already mentioned. My goal in this class is not to create ideological disciples, but my
Mm,
goal in the class is to try to help students understand why people believe the way that they do. So, for instance, one of the experiences that I always encourage in this class is We always watch Spike Lee's film Malcolm X. We read several of Malcolm's speeches because many of my students come to class with a particular understanding of what Malcolm X was always about. Generally, they think that Malcolm X was seeking to kill all white people. And one of the things I say is like, now you can agree with Malcolm's black nationalism or disagree with his black nationalism. That's fine. But I think that your image of what he was all about is not quite accurate. And so we're going to try and have a couple of experiential opportunities to understand more. So what we'll do is my wife and I will host the students in our home. We'll, get a bunch of snacks and we'll watch the movie Malcolm X, and then we'll have a talk back session. Like, what surprised you? What shocked you? And what's always interesting is that experience, even just watching the film, does so much to humanize Malcolm X to these students. They might come away saying, like, and many of them was like, well, I'm not necessarily a black nationalist, but I understand why he was the way he was. And maybe he wasn't just about killing people. Maybe it's more complicated. Maybe it's more nuanced than that. And one of the points that I draw from this film is the the surpassing importance of the arts in helping us understand perspectives different than our own. Whether it's something like an artistically done film like Malcolm X, whether it's music, whether it's painting, whether it's dance, the arts have a rare ability to take an individual out of their sphere into the sphere of another. That's why you have forms of music that may be rooted in local communities but are exportable around the world, because even though they're different than those people's experiences, they can still resonate with the emotions of displacement or hope or joy that surfaces in the art forms that we kind of share around the globe.
Mm, that's really good. Yeah, that's really good. I mean, we can see from when we grew up, right? Hip hop
Yes,
was in a pretty confined environment, not a lot of money
that's right.
actually, and
That's
and
right.
now it's one of the largest art forms there is. So that's one small example. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so with that being said, and as we talk about those kind of crossovers and things of that nature, what are some practical ways to help people in various communities translate their experience to other people and cultures? And so, first, we're talking about like coming in and looking from the outside in at a different culture, but now, how can everybody in every culture and every worldview, or not say every worldview, but different political belief system or ideologies, that how can they remain human and not fear losing that, but also effectively communicate not just their positions, but the
Right.
the experience of being them.
Sure. Yeah. So let's take something like racism. It's a hot button issue in today's society. We like to talk about it occasionally. One of the hardest things is talking to someone about racism who's never experienced racism. That's just a challenge, and it's a challenge that is devastating the church right now because it's creating such division where people are saying it doesn't exist or it does exist, and they're not actually communicating well. So when we talk about how do we tell stories well, it's not just about, and this is where we often lead the conversation. Oftentimes we focus on, let me share my experience, my unfortunate experience with law enforcement, or my unfortunate experience with employment or trying to secure employment, or my unfortunate experience with education. If I stop there and just share with you my experience, you may choose to believe or disbelieve my experience, but it's not really putting you in the position to try to at least get a glimpse of what it's like. So, for instance, one of the conversations that I'll have with my students, um, that they'll raise for me a lot of times is, well, Dr. Hill, why should we talk about reparations, or what should we think about reparations? And my point in this conversation, not to say yay or nay, we should have reparations. That's a longer conversation that we don't have time to get into in the podcast. But they'll ask me, help us understand why someone would say that we should have reparations. I'm like, I'm happy to give you a logical argument for reparations, and help you understand it this way. And so what I do for my students is I try to put it in a realm that they can understand. I was like, let's say we go through the semester and I just get mad at people from the state, let's just say I'm from Illinois. Let's say I get mad at everybody from the state of Illinois. So I say all students from the state of Illinois are getting an F in my class no matter how they perform. And I was like, for all my Illinois students, how would you all feel for that? How would you all feel about that? And it's like, well, no, we wouldn't like it. I was like, let's say I did that, and you all discover, oh, wait, we got an F, and there's no good reason that we got an F. And then you go to the institution and you tell the institution, hey, Dr. Hill gave us an F, and we didn't deserve an F. And all the institution does is says they're sorry to you. I was like,
Mm.
how many of you would feel like you achieved justice based on them just giving you an apology that I gave you an F? I was like, none of you would, because that F is going to have lingering consequences on your ability to secure competitive internships, to get into graduate school, to even secure the employment that you want. You recognize that your F, in order for you to get justice as you conceive it, the grade needs to be changed because it has effects into the future. I was like, that would be a logical argument in favor of reparations. Now, you might agree or disagree with it, but it's like, that's how someone would make an argument for it. And it's like, ah, I never thought about it. So when they're talking about the legacy of certain histories here in the US, they might say this has lingering implications for people that were never righted.
Mm.
That would be the argument. That would be a way I would tell them a story that's situated within their world to help them understand how someone from a different context might argue a point that they might disagree with.
That's really helpful. Yeah, that's a really good example. And I think, like you said, once you experience it or experience or experience the effects of some form of injustice, you're much more um, apt to be about justice in every situation. And I think, unfortunately, and I'll say this real quick, I think justice has been confined actually in a way it shouldn't be. So
Yes,
justice, especially
that's
biblical
right.
justice, it crosses everything. It really goes with you first, your heart, your sin,
That's
and
exactly right.
right. But we've in society we've made justice simply about police or about the
Right, right,
justice
right.
system or about those things that are real. But but when you drill down to that level and that's the only part of it that you talk about, other people will get tired of hearing that part, right? And I get that, but
That's right. That's
it's
right.
a bigger issue of justice than just those things. And so I think both sides need to be better with their argumentation as well as with their listening skills. I think.
That's right. That's right. And understanding the concerns and understanding what motivates certain behaviors. Because if you understand someone's behavior and why they're doing the things they do, it equips you better to respond to it. Because what we do is we kind of decide why someone's acting a certain way, and that may or may not be why they're acting a certain way. And if we just listen to their story, maybe we have better insight to dialogue with them.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Okay, so with that being said, how do we tell and listen to stories well? You kind of alluded to some of this already, but so that we actually hear what people are saying and perhaps learn something in the process. And I think the kind of underlying part in this question is how can you speak to the fact that when we enter a conversation that we already know may end up in a debate or argument, are we entering that conversation to learn or to win?
That's right.
And
That's
I
right.
guess that's my question. And how would you advise or how would you teach on that?
So, what I would encourage folks to think about from that standpoint is we have to become better at asking questions.
Mm.
If my goal is to win a debate, I'm going to approach it with a certain framework. But many of the conversations when I enter where there's a difference of opinion, I just want to understand. Like, I'm not sure that we're actually going to agree at the end of the day, but I can understand your position better as a result of it. So I want to come in. So please tell me why you believe this. What's informed your thoughts on this over the years? What are some books that you'd recommend me to read? And what that does is it simultaneously gives you insight that you wouldn't have, but it also disarms the other person because it's not an ad hominem attack anymore. It's a desire to actually understand the other person. And so, one of the things that I love to do, I mentioned my Black political communication class. I love to bring people to class that I fundamentally disagree with. And they come to class, we know where Dr. Hill is so wrong, and we have wonderful dialogues. Many of
Mm.
these are friends of mine, so we actually end up having like intense debates, not vitriolic, but we have intense debates in class. But like to be able to model for my students that just because you disagree with someone doesn't mean that that gives you an excuse to not understand that person because they
Mm.
have a story too. And what we also can't do is we can't essentialize what it means to be a certain identity, whether we do this racially, from a class standpoint, or a gender standpoint. Like people have different thoughts. political communication class. There are diversity of political views in the black community. So just because someone voted for this person or that person, you can't challenge their blackness. Like they might have a different set of experiences, and that's okay. And so where do we give people space to be themselves? And it's
Mm.
incumbent upon us to try to understand who they are as a point of engaging them. And so how do we tell them stories but also ask to hear their stories? I think we prioritize, I want to say what I have to say. Well, no, maybe we need to understand this person and who they are before we rush to kind of share all of our thoughts.
Wow, that is so good. And I think underlying a lot of this and everything you're saying is to humanize people. And I think
Yes.
over the last 20 years, I don't know, I guess '05. So yeah, almost 20 years that social media has kind of been with us. And I
Oof.
think the dehumanization has just increased with that.
That's right.
But then we
That's right.
also see these other things increase with that: the rise in depression, the rise in suicide, the rise in um, teen despondency, or whatever you want to call it. Like, these things are going up as we
That's right.
simultaneously have access to, quote unquote, more information. And the line that was kind of told to us is that if we just get more people more information, everybody will understand better, and then everything will be
Right.
good. Well, didn't quite work out that way. Uh,
Right. Exactly.
but
Because information is not the same as knowledge.
say that again. Say that again.
Information is not the same as knowledge.
And so, what's the difference? Because that's really good.
So I would say, like, information might be me knowing that if I live in the Chicago area, if I take I-88 east, I will get to Chicago.
Yep.
Knowledge tells me that at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, taking I-88 east is not the best way to get to Chicago because there's going to be traffic going into the city at that time. So maybe I need to take an alternate route. There's a sense of
Mm.
knowing facts, but also knowing how to process those facts, how to respond to those facts, how to utilize those facts in the context of our lives and our engagement with one another. And so many times we're content with just like what we believe to be facts or just like information, but we actually don't know what to do with it.
Yeah. Wow, that's really good. I used to do the. You reminded me. I used to say knowledge, understanding, wisdom, and so I say, like, knowledge
Yes.
is you know the fact 1 + 1 is 2. Great. Understanding is, okay. So how do I understand it in a practice? Okay, I have one apple, now I have another apple, now I have two apples, right? But wisdom is applied knowledge, and
That's right.
this is the step I don't think everyone always gets to. I don't always get to, where my knowledge of a certain thing or certain people or certain situation, now what do I do with it in a lived practical sense?
That's
Um,
right.
yeah,
That's exactly right.
yeah. So we need more wisdom, not just knowledge.
No,
Um,
that's right. And that's what Proverbs is all about. Like,
yeah.
the beginning of wisdom and how do we I mean, my mother always used to say that wisdom was learning to see life from God's perspective.
Mm,
Like that divine perspective that really drives that pursuit of wisdom. Yeah.
wow, that's really good. Okay, so with these things being said, what do you wish you had more time to research or to talk about that you believe the public needs to hit to better understand?
Yeah, if we're talking about like things of like argumentation and apologetics and defending and supporting positions, I actually think we need a lot more time to talk about the role of emotional appeals. And here's why I say that is we kind of view emotional appeals as kind of like a negative aspect. So I'm going to be logical, but this person's being emotional. And we give like this negative aspect to emotion. And I think there's a flaw in that. I think
Mm,
the flaw is that we are not one-dimensional beings. Yes, we strive for logic, but read some of those prophets. Read Jesus. Like emotion has a role and a specific role in the communication of the truth. I think we view like rationalism as if it will save us. But as I said, people rationally thought that the earth was flat. It wasn't like their
yeah.
rationality did not save them from error. And so rationality, logic is a good thing, but emotion is also important in us communicating importance, communicating significance, communicating love. Like we can't just communicate some of these things coldly. But like, no, this is why this matters. This is why this person's story cares. This is how we elevate people's discourse. And so I would try to encourage people through research and through dialogue, don't sleep on the value of emotions. Now,
Mm,
emotions like rationality can be abused,
yeah.
but the threat of its abuse does not equal us needing to distance ourselves from it as if it's somehow inherently dangerous to us.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think God's a holistic God, obviously, and He cares about the whole human. And so I think, even to your point, sometimes we can get into this save the soul, but we ignore the container of the soul, the person.
Yes,
But God cares about all of it,
that's
right?
right. That's right.
Mind, body, and
That's
soul. And so,
exactly
yeah,
right. And if we don't reflect that, we're not caring for the whole person.
yeah. Wow, that's really good. Okay. In spite of that, and in spite of this access to information that we now have, or seemingly to have, we have a quantity of information. Whether or not it's all good is another debate. But more recent generations, younger generations, seem, even with that, to not be as well versed in history or what came before us. I mean, even from wars and just different countries and who did what, and forget religion for a
Yes.
second, but just in history in general. And so, how can we, or how do you help them just navigate history better?
Yeah, I think one of the points that parents, educators, and thought leaders like yourself can do, we have to situate the arguments that we make historically. And so, one of the questions that you've already asked me is, what are the stories that we need to be telling? One of the key aspects of we need to be telling historicals because it's kind of like if you go to Hebrews chapter 11, in the book of Hebrews, what is the message that the author is trying to give? He's trying to tell the Christians that hang on. I know it's tough, but hang on. Then he gets to chapter 11. He's like, look at this great cloud of witnesses. That historical argument. He says, David did this, Samson did this, all these people did these things. Therefore, hang on. He's like, the evidence of history is your rationale, is your reason, is your logic to keep living faithfully.
Mm,
What's incumbent upon us in this moment is to look to history as we seek to live faithfully in the present. And so, what I think we have to do, and what I seek to do as both an educator and as a parent, is I try to tell my kids, here's what happened before you. Because for so many people, given our saturation and exposure to things like social media, we think we live in an eternal now.
mm,
We think that what's happening right now is what's always happened. And we fail to see, no, no, no. What's happening right now in our nation with polarization has a long history. We didn't just get here yesterday because this person or that person was elected. There were some historical antecedents if you want to understand where we're at, if you want to know how to navigate where we're at, and if you want to know how to change where we're at. If you want to live faithfully, there is no way around history and knowing what came before you. It's one of the interesting things about the Old Testament that the majority of God's commands to Israel in the Old Testament are what? Remember,
mm,
remember, remember. And so I think part of the challenge that we face is how do we get people to remember history, but also to interrogate history biblically?
mm,
Because it's very easy for us to engage our history from a purely a standpoint of I'm an American or I'm a black man or I'm this or I'm that, and that shades and defines what we see and how we evaluate it. And that's not to say that all those perceptions are wrong, but first and foremost, our historical lens needs to be subordinated to the authority of Scripture. That's the lens that we use to interrogate what did or did not happen and how we should relate to it today in our nation's past and in the world in global history.
wow, that's great. I love that, and I think that that's a very important point to give us the knowledge of how to lead into these investigations that don't come in as I'm a this or I'm a that, as far as your political or racial or gender barriers, but come in as I'm a follower of Jesus, and then enter
That's right.
into, yeah, that's really good. So with that being said, and with all these things being said, what are some of the current challenges you see or have experienced or do experience as a Christian educator? And what can you kind of offer as advice to other Christian educators, especially ones who may be teaching in secular schools where they can't necessarily say or
Of
do
course.
everything they want to do or say? What's some of the things you experience and what's some advice
Yeah.
you have?
I love that question. One of the things that we see happening is that our access to information gives us confidence that we know more than we do. And
Mm,
what I mean by that is I can Google it, I can ask AI to come up with an answer for me. So maybe I think I actually know this topic. No, you don't know it. Get back to the information and knowledge. This doesn't mean that you know it. And so what I wrestle with is students coming in class thinking that they've thought through these things. And so the students will come in class and I want to call this Marxism or I want to call this racism. And one of the key things that I always force my students to do when they throw out a key hot button term, what is your definition of that? And where did
yeah,
you get that definition from? And
yeah,
is that the right definition to have? And that kind of question disrupts the conversation because the students generally have never thought about that before. And so I was like, okay, if you're going to call that Marxism, tell me how that relates to what Marx said in the Communist Manifesto or Das Kapital. Like, how does that relate to that? If you're going to call this racism, tell me how that relates to contemporary definitions of racial discrimination that we see coming down from various scholars. What tradition of racism and racial understanding are you coming from when you use that term? So, have you actually in this understanding in a particular way? Because if you're not, we need to make sure that we actually know what we're talking about before we try to position ourselves as thought leaders on every issue that's surfacing in the public sphere. And let me just say this, there's many Christian leaders that need to think about this because they want to position themselves as experts on every topic, and it's very clear to anyone who is an expert they don't know what they're talking about. And
yeah.
mainly, getting back to our previous question, because they don't know the history of the issue.
Yes. Could not agree more on a range of issues. And I think even to that point, I tell people all the time, so getting a PhD, so our culture doesn't really get this, but people in academia and hopefully pastors and people in leadership should get this, that you having a PhD does not mean you're an expert in everything of a higher learning level.
Yeah,
It means you're an expert usually in one very specific part of one very specific thing, right? But you hear people with PhDs
yes,
in biology and they're giving, diatribes on social discourse or something like that. Now, we're all entitled to our opinion, but that person's not an expert
sure,
in that
of course.
sphere, right? But the rest of us who don't
Exactly.
have, right, the rest of us who don't have a PhD, we hear that, oh, Dr. So and so said XYZ, not understanding that that's not their field of expertise, but then we take it as no pun intended, gospel truth, when they may be just as wrong as you.
That's right. That's exactly right. And that gets back to how we discern facts and everything. Because how do we even understand someone's credibility? Are they credible to speak on this? Just because someone has PhD behind their name does not mean that they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely right. In fact, I remember I've said this before. The first two assignments when I was getting my master's were reading atheist works, and both of them had PhD. I
Mhm.
mean, the equivalent of PhDs. That one, I don't think PhD was a term then, but
Yes,
they were much smarter than me. Is
of
the
course.
point, but also very wrong. So,
Of
uh,
course. Sure.
all right. Well,
Yeah,
look, this has been an awesome discussion. I have one more question. In your talk that I heard, you mentioned something called
of course.
imaginative capacity. First, what did you mean by that? And then, how do
Yeah.
we fuel the imaginative capacity in young people to be able to live biblically in our current culture? I do a lot of my apologetic work directed towards youth and young adults. And I was a former youth pastor. So I'm always thinking about this. So, A, what is imaginative capacity? And how do we fuel that imaginative capacity in our young people?
Yeah. So I think when I think of imaginative capacity, I think of that classic Robert Browning quote where he says, "Oh, that a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's
Hmm.
a heaven for?" And so when I think about imaginative capacity, do we actually have the capacity to think beyond what is to what could be. So if I look at my life, I see here's where I am, here's what I struggle with, here's the sins that beset me, whatever. We could talk about a variety of things. But do I have the imagination to imagine, like, by God's grace, this is what I could be? By God's grace, by God's grace, this is what my community could be. This is what my church could be. This is what my nation could be. This is what my world could be. Because if we have that imaginative capacity energizes our commitment to do the work that we're called to do by God in the present. It's when we are complacent and think, well, this is what it is, that we have no reason to work harder. But it's like, I wake up and go hard at work in the morning because it's like, God has gripped my heart with a vision of, hey, here's how I might be able to use you. And it's like, it's not that we see it right now, but we see what could be. And so how does our imagination drive our Christian commitment in our local communities and in the broader Christian community that we are a part of?
Wow. Well said. And that's a great place to leave it. Man, I really appreciate your taking the time out. I know you just got off a long flight, so, hopefully it's still the right day for you in your mind. I thank you for coming. I thank you for sharing some knowledge, some wisdom.
I'm doing my best.
Amen. Well, thank you. And thank you all for tuning in.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're most welcome. Thank you all for tuning in. And until next time, peace. Yeah.